All right, welcome back. Streaming live from my house, Bio 153 online. And today we're going to talk about chapter 27, referring to fluids and electrolytes. And that's the first part of the chapter. And I figured, what could be any better? This is kind of a competitive chapter. We think of running and fluids and things like that, and doing aerobic exercise. Then here we are the champions if you're competitive by nature. So welcome back, everybody. Again, streaming live to all of you guys out there in the Tri-Cities and out living in the thumb of Michigan and up in northern Michigan, or perhaps even down near Flint. So here we are once again, fluids and electrolytes. Eventually, warmer weather will be coming, and it will be important, of course, to stay hydrated. When we start to see the sun more frequently and doing more exercise outside, when the warmer temperatures come, when summer finally arrives. So, starting off here, we're going to take a look at overall body water content. And we can see there's definitely some variation here amongst the genders and even age. So early on, when you're a small little child, you can see here that water percentage in your body is roughly about 73% or so. As you age, that percentage goes down. So for women, approximately, we could say, middle-aged women, about 50% of a woman's body is made up of water. In comparison to a middle-aged man, where the level potentially could be 60%, and a lot of that variation is based off of differences in definitely muscle overall. And as we eventually get older and older, and we make it into the golden years, as much as we don't want to age, I definitely don't want to age, but it's just a reality of life. Eventually, your water percentage will be down around 45%, or even less than that. So hence, very important to keep up with your fluid intake when you get older. There's a greater increase of heat stroke or heat exhaustion when you're older. You're more prone to that. So definitely important to be aware of these differences in the body water content. When we look at the body as a whole, there are two major fluid compartments. So I'll go ahead and look at these here for you. These two major compartments are known as the extracellular fluid, the ECF. So right here, extracellular fluid, the ECF. And the extracellular fluid is the fluid found outside of your cells. These are made up of two subcategories, made up of interstitial fluid, IF, interstitial fluid, the fluid found surrounding your cells, and also right here, the plasma of your blood. This is the fluid component of the blood here. So interstitial fluid, again, fluid surrounding the cells, and plasma volume, the fluid component of the blood. The other subcategory, when we look at the fluid compartments of the body, is looking at the intracellular fluid, the ICF. So, the intracellular fluid is the fluid found actually within the cells of your body, the fluid found in the cytosol, or also known as cytoplasm. So important to know these two major fluid compartments. Now looking at the composition of body fluids, first looking at water. Water makes up a good percentage of your body, and this is considered to be the universal solvent of life. Another important part of the composition of body fluids is looking at solutes. And solutes are broken down into two major categories. Solutes are broken down into non-electrolytes and electrolytes. So the non-electrolytes do not dissociate in water. They would be things such as various nutrients, glucose, lipids, things like that. And even various nitrogenous waste products indicated here, such as urea and creatine. While electrolytes do have the capability of dissociating into ions in water, such as salt, sodium chloride, bicarbonate, a weak base, potassium, sodium, calcium, and so on and so forth. When we think of these electrolytes, what are some functions of electrolytes? Can you think of any? What are some functions of electrolytes? And hopefully some are coming to mind here when you think back on the semester and perhaps even in 152. If we were to per se maybe focus in on especially these three, they play a very important role. Think about earlier in the semester when we went over the action potential of cardiac muscle cells with the heart. Extremely important when we think of heart contraction. Or perhaps when you go back even further and you remember back the action potential of the neuron and skeletal muscle contraction. So it's important to have an appropriate level of these electrolytes in our body and definitely replenish. If you're doing excessive aerobic activity and sweating a lot, you're going to leave a lot of salt will be coming out of your body. So it's important to replenish. All right, so this picture here, we're looking at the electrolyte composition of the body. And it gives you an idea, this bar graph, of the various electrolytes in the body. And these electrolytes have a charge. So they're either going to be considered a cation, these electrolytes, so a positive charge, or a negative, known as anion, a negative charge. So electrolytes have a charge to them, either positive or negative. And a lot of this is involved with ionic bonding. We think of an ion, a charged particle. All right, so let's take a look at this bar graph here. So you can see some of these electrolytes are found in very high amounts in the body. The bottom part of the graph here, the x-axis, is showing you the diversity of different electrolytes in the body, while the y-axis looks at the total solute concentration, so the amount ultimately in the body. So some of these definitely are in pretty high amounts here, as we can see. So we can see that here. Sodium is found in pretty high amount, potassium, chloride, hydrogen phosphate, etc. So, when we think of the extracellular fluid, we've mentioned that term already. This is the fluid found outside of your cells, extracellular fluid. The major cation found there is sodium, while the major anion is chloride. And so they're going to be found in very high amounts in the extracellular fluid, the area found ultimately outside of the cell. And of course, this is made up of the blood plasma and interstitial fluid. In contrast to the intracellular fluid, and this is the fluid, again, found internally in your cells of the body in the cytosol, the major cation is potassium, while the major anion is hydrogen phosphate, so HPO. And you even have some protein anions there as well, indicated on the bar graph. So the big gist to get off of this slide here is definitely be aware electrolytes have a charge, either negative or positive. So positive cation, negative anion, and that you have some really major cations and anions in your body, either found in the extracellular fluid or the intracellular fluid. So be aware of some of these major cations and anions that I've indicated already, such as sodium, chloride for electrolytes here, and potassium and hydrogen phosphate, and maybe even consider the protein anions. Okay? So that's what you need to get off of this slide. All right, review of our extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid. So once again, look at this. Here's the extracellular fluid. It's made up of two subcategories, the overall blood plasma and interstitial fluid of the body. And again, here's that intracellular fluid, and we find that in the tissue cells of our body internally, which of course contains the cytosol. So you can see how these fluid compartments are critical when it comes to the movement of a lot of various materials in the body. So here we can see two critical gases with movement, your oxygen and carbon dioxide gas, which directly is going through these compartments all the time. You can see here the oxygen going one way, carbon dioxide gas going the other way. Even movement of nutrients, water, ions going through the fluid compartments. When we think of nutrient absorption in the digestive system, and even the kidneys here, when we look at movement of nitrogenous waste products, ions, water, etc., with the urinary system. So very critical to have these two major fluid compartments in our body. All right, what we're going to take a look at next here is the major sources of water intake and output in your body on a daily basis. So first we'll talk about the overall average intake of water per day. The majority of your water comes into your body through your beverages. So what type of beverages are you drinking? So, you're drinking water, you're drinking tea, drinking milk. So this brings in the majority of your average intake of water per day, roughly 60%. 30% of water intake per day is based off of your foods. So think of your food selection. Think of your diet. If you're eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, you're definitely bringing a lot of water into your body. So there must be a reason during the summertime when it's 4th of July gathering with the family, right, and friends, and you got watermelon right there and other fruits perhaps to keep you hydrated on a very warm summer day. And finally, 10% of water intake is based off of cellular metabolism. On the other side of the picture here, we're looking at the average output per day of water. Majority of water loss is based off of urination. Okay, so that's 60%. 28% of water loss is based off of losses through the skin. So water loss through the skin and through the lungs. So definitely that plays a significant role based off of humidity levels in the house or outside. If you're living in an area where there's a lot of humidity, hence a lot more water possibly containing in your body. If you live in a dry environment like out in Nevada or Utah or something like that, well, it's a lot easier to get dehydrated much quicker with low humidity levels. Not as much water in the atmosphere. And then 8% of water loss is through sweating. That's on average. Of course, some people sweat a lot more, right? And then 4% is feces, defecation, how you can lose some water. So be aware of these major sources of water intake and output. So make sure to know them. Make sure to know the percentages. All right, taking a look at the thirst mechanism here again. We briefly mentioned that in the last chapter, but here we have some review again for the thirst mechanism. Ultimately, this thirst mechanism is controlled up in the brain in the hypothalamus. We've mentioned this a lot this semester, controlling a lot of various structures. So that thirst center, again, we find that up in the brain of the hypothalamus. And you ask yourselves, what type of activities trigger that thirst center? Well, especially you're doing a lot of exercise outside, and you're out exercising, over 30 minutes or more, with all the sweat, you could be getting thirsty. Or it's a very dry day, you're spending hours, countless hours outside, or it's dry where you work inside in the building. Again, that's a big thing there. So a lot of different items can trigger that thirst center. There's a lot of signs that you're getting thirsty too. If you have an increase in plasma osmolality, ultimately that might be a decrease in saliva, and ultimately it leads to the dry mouth. This is typically a signal that you are extremely thirsty, and signals then are sent to the brain, to the hypothalamus. And instantly then, that leads to you drinking water. Another sign could be decreased plasma volume, a fall in blood pressure, and ultimately in time, this leads to the thirst center being activated too. And ultimately then, you go ahead and drink some water. Just like this. That was some good water right there, let me tell you. I'm feeling better already. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling just great. So there you go. All right, moving on. Some of these slides here are probably review from what you've seen in the past. So this slide here is ultimately looking at ADH. So remember, ADH is a hormone which stands for the antidiuretic hormone, ADH. And ADH is important in your body, this hormone. ADH controls water reabsorption. ADH controls water reabsorption. Now, we've already talked about in the last chapter of how ADH plays a significant role with controlling water reabsorption in the nephron, in the collecting duct. But the one thing we didn't really talk about is, well, where is the hormone ADH produced? Where is it released from? Now we talk about it. The hormone ADH is released from a structure known as the posterior pituitary gland, which is found up in your brain. So posterior pituitary gland, or when you think of the pituitary gland, there's different lobes, right? So this is the posterior lobe. The posterior lobe. Because there's an anterior lobe too, right? So this is referring to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland in the brain. That's where ADH is released from. And so you can see this here with the diagram then. ADH then would be released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland here. This picture here is showing the hypothalamus, again, the idea of the thirst center. And then from here, ADH travels to your blood, eventually travels to your kidneys, and plays a role with the collecting duct in the nephron to either increase water reabsorption or decrease. So here we can see, well, a decrease in the amount of ADH release. So do you remember some examples of when ADH was suppressed significantly? Do you remember some of those? Give yourself a couple seconds to maybe think about that again from our last chapter. So some of these examples where ADH is suppressed, less of that hormone being produced, we think about that, less ADH being produced. So if that's the case, less of that being produced, you're not holding on to as much water. And so typically with that hormone being suppressed, increased urinary output, right? And so this is the case with a diuretic again. So if somebody's taking diuretic pills like Lasix for their heart, or maybe it's alcohol-induced, drinking beer or wine, or caffeine from coffee or Mountain Dew or pop, this definitely will lead to a least decrease in ADH production and ultimately increase in urinary output. Down here, we think of an increase in ADH production. The goal here is to increase water reabsorption, which we can see on the graph here. Increase water reabsorption. We want to hold on to more water in the body. The net effect of that is a very low urinary output, which typically happens when someone is very dehydrated, lack of water. Definitely a sign they should be drinking more water. Okay, so definitely make sure to review and look over this. So now we look at the extremes when we think of water in the body. And what we're looking at here is the condition of dehydration. It's possible maybe you've been here before. I know I certainly have, especially out west on hikes and things like that. I'm not keeping up with my water intake, and you're losing a lot more water from your body at a quicker rate when you're out west hiking or running or anything like that. So this brings us to the idea of the amount of water and solutes in the body. It goes back to the idea of osmosis. If you remember from last semester, you would have talked about osmosis and the different tonicity states, such as isotonic, hypotonic, hypertonic. The healthy state for our body to be in with overall proper equilibrium and balance of water and solutes such as salt would be isotonic. That's the condition that our body needs to be in. But you're kind of slipping out of that when you're in the state of dehydration. So in this case, with dehydration with significant water loss, we ask ourselves what tonicity state, osmotic state is occurring here. And the answer here, anytime we're talking about dehydration and significant water loss, this would be what's known as hypertonic, okay? Hypertonic. So this is where someone is hypertonic. And anytime you look at a term hyper, more, in this case, a much higher amount of salt when we think of solutes versus water. So what happens here in this situation, here is a cell right here. Get my laser pointer here for you. Here's a cell right here. And this cell is losing water to the ECF, the extracellular fluid, through osmosis. And these cells in your body are shrinking. They're going through a process known as crenation. And again, we look at osmosis. Water moves from an area of higher concentration to lower concentration. So water here is moving from high to low because out in the ECF, you have a high amount of salt. So a significant amount of water is leaving your cells, going into the interstitial fluid, into the extracellular fluid here, and your cells are shrinking through crenation. Definitely some signs, symptoms of significant dehydration would be someone with a very sticky oral mucosa, dry mouth. You're very thirsty, dry, flushed skin, maybe not urinary, your urinary output's very low. Those are huge signs. Of course, with significant water loss, it could be the result of lots of sweating. If you stop sweating, that's obviously a very dangerous sign. Lack of water available, diarrhea, vomiting, get you dehydrated quickly. So definitely a dangerous sign to be in. If somebody is extremely dehydrated, you get to a point where even drinking enough water won't help you. You literally will have to go to the hospital and you'll have to get an IV put in with saline solution to get proper hydration levels back in your body if you're very, very dehydrated. So a very dangerous situation here, for sure. The extreme opposite situation, we look at different osmotic states. We look at this condition here of hydration, overhydration. You know, we get an idea of dehydration, that's pretty dangerous, but we may not always necessarily think of someone drinking too much water could be lethal. But it can. If someone's drinking way too much water in a very short period of time, it can be very harmful to your body and potentially could lead to death. So in this situation, what osmotic tonicity state is occurring here? This would be hypotonic. Okay, hypotonic. So this is hypotonic. Hypo versus hypo, referring to a low amount of solutes in the extracellular fluid. And that's the case here. So what happens when someone drinks a lot of excessive water? Again, with osmosis, the water moves from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So you have a lot of water, which is now moving into your cells. You can see my arrows here. And it leads ultimately to your cells in your body swelling. So much so that they can't tolerate all the pressure from the water coming in. And it could lead to cell lysis, where the cells actually implode and explode, which is extremely lethal and dangerous. Some of the signs that you're drinking way too much water could be nauseation, an effect of vomiting, possibly skeletal muscle cramping, and if it gets really bad, a lot of pressure on the brain, cerebral edema, and eventually in time could lead to death. So you have to be careful how much water you drink. This is really the case with a lot of runners who they feel this need. They have to chug and chug the water when they cross the finish line. It's better to take a couple sips than chug and chug. That's very dangerous, drinking way too much water in a short period of time, instantaneously. Sometimes there's other situations where people are chugging the water too, exercising things. So you need to be careful here with this. With anything in life, you need to have a proper balance of fluid intake. We're now going to talk about electrolytes. And these electrolytes, again, typically have a charge. They could be a salt, they could be an acid or a base, so acids or bases. And we think of the importance of salts when it comes to controlling fluid movements, providing minerals, proper membrane permeability with heart contraction, muscle contraction, and even activity of secretory activity. So So there's a lot of different items out in the market when it comes to keeping your electrolytes. A lot of people think they just need to drink water when they exercise. But if you're someone who sweats a lot, yeah, you're losing water, but you're also losing salt. And you have a good idea of that when you are doing a prolonged endurance activity of biking or running perhaps, or maybe even being outside cutting the grass or working in the garden or playing baseball. And you look at your hat and there's white streaks on the hat, that's salt. Sometimes you can even have the salt crystals out on the outside of your body, which is a sign of significant sweating. So one of the classic items used to replenish your salt intake, I'm circling here, of course, is Gatorade. This was developed back in the 1980s. This was developed in Florida. We think of the Florida Gators. It was actually developed by a football assistant coach for the University of Florida in Gainesville. The assistant football coach developed this concoction of Gatorade, hence the term here, Gator. Of course, this guy's probably doing quite well now, probably retired, and now, of course, this is something you see all over when you shop. I drink quite a bit of Gatorade myself because I sweat quite a bit when I exercise, and this helps to replenish my sodium and potassium levels. There's other items in the market to stay hydrated with your electrolyte intake. There's goo. Goo is something that a lot of athletes will use, aerobic athletes doing triathlons, running events. You can typically buy this at like Dick's Sporting Goods, or you go to an athletic store like Runners in Saginaw, Bay City, or Midland, or Mount Pleasant. So those are typical, or you can do old school methods. You know, pickles. Pickles have a lot of salt, electrolytes in them. Drinking pickle juice can be key. Or some people might go ahead and bring pretzels along because of the salt on them. So there's a lot of ways to get electrolytes, old-fashioned ways and more modern ways to get your salt in your body. All right, next taking a look at another critical hormone, definitely some review from last chapter. Looking at our hormone here known as aldosterone. Aldosterone. And the hormone aldosterone is very important when it comes to sodium reabsorption. Sodium reabsorption. And of course, sodium plays a significant role with potassium secretion too. The one thing we didn't talk about last time is, well, where is aldosterone released from in the body? Aldosterone, this critical hormone, is released from the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex. That's where aldosterone is released from. And this is found in the adrenal gland. Remember, the adrenal gland sits on top of your kidneys. So this is where aldosterone is produced. And ultimately then, aldosterone here travels through the bloodstream to the kidneys, to the nephron, and two major areas of the nephron it plays a role in is the distal convoluted tubulobe and the collecting duct. So aldosterone plays a big role with sodium reabsorption. You can see that here. And likewise, potassium secretion. So that's the importance of the release of aldosterone to control the amount of sodium and potassium in the body. So definitely important to review this for sure. What we're going to take a look at next, this is definitely new, is looking at a very important peptide in the body in regards to changes in blood pressure, which is known as the atrial neuritic peptide. The atrial neuritic peptide, known as the ANP. So the ANP. We'll highlight this for you. Atrial neuritic peptide, the ANP. And again, the important function here plays an important role with blood pressure regulation. So blood pressure, in this case, helping to decrease blood pressure if blood pressure is elevated, and likewise a decrease in blood volume. So we'll go through this chart here. I know there's a lot happening here, but we'll take this by step-by-step approach. In the case that someone's blood pressure increases, like we see down here, blood pressure increases because of a stress-related activity. When we think of the sympathetic nervous system, blood pressure going up from exercise, whatever it might be, your cardiac cells in your heart, especially in the right or left atrium, will release this peptide, the atrioneuritic peptide. Based off the release of the peptide from the heart, the cardiac muscles, from the right atrium, left atrium, see this here, this leads to quite a response. This can lead to a response to the adrenal cortex, releasing aldosterone, a decrease in aldosterone release, and of course the effect of that is a decrease in sodium, which can lead to a decrease in blood pressure. Messages can also be sent to the brain, to the hypothalamus, posterior lobe pituitary gland, to release an ADH release, and the effect of a decrease in water reabsorption, likewise decrease in blood pressure. And even messages can be sent to your kidneys, to the jugular glomerular apparatus complex, which can lead to a decrease in the release of the enzyme renin, a decrease then in angiotensinogen 2, that unique plasma protein we've talked about before, and the effect of the blood vessels undergoing then vasodilation. So dilation, expanding, result, decrease in blood pressure. Okay? So definitely make sure to review this. Again, when we look at this, ultimately the atrioneuritic peptide is released because of a response and change in blood pressure, especially with an increase in blood pressure. The goal here is to decrease the blood pressure, the blood volume, to get that blood pressure back to a state of homeostasis. All right, it's time for review. iClicker time. So our first review question today is number 1. The extracellular fluid is found in the blank. The extracellular fluid is found in the blank. So take a couple moments to go ahead and come up with your answer. All right, and the correct answer here for number 1, I would probably go with choice letter D. Both A and B, the blood plasma and the interstitial fluids. So letter D is the correct answer here. Number 2, about 60% of average water loss per day is from what? So what would be the correct answer here? About 60% of average water loss per day is from what? And the correct answer here, hopefully you went with this too, would be choice letter B, urine. Urine, letter B is the correct answer. Number 3, blank is a major cation that is found in the intracellular fluid. Blank is a major cation that is found in the intracellular fluid. So, what would be the correct answer here? What would be the correct answer here? And the correct answer here, for this one, I'd probably go with a cation, of course, which would be a positive ion here. And I would probably go with choice C. Again, the clue here, intracellular fluid inside the cell at rest. So potassium, letter C. Number 4, when someone experiences low sodium levels, this stimulates the blank to release the hormone aldosterone, which targets the blank and collecting duct to increase sodium reabsorption. So, what would be the correct answer here? What would be the correct answer here? What choice would you go with here? And the correct answer, I would probably go, how about with choice letter C? The adrenal cortex, definitely where aldosterone is released from, and the distal convoluted tubule. So that would be the correct answer here. All right, I hope you enjoyed your lecture on fluids and electrolytes. And until next time, we'll see you later.